We are already seeing the impacts of climate change on a number of our communities. So a do-nothing approach really does not work from a long-term standpoint. These investments, and they are truly investments, benefit multiple generations because these are the assets that are built for 50, 60, 70 years.
As we've heard over and over on this podcast, our grid needs upgrades. And as Christian mentioned last episode, it's not clean energy's fault. New York has grid infrastructure that is nearing 100 years old, and if we want to continue not having to worry about the lights coming on, we need investments. Today, we have a fascinating look behind the curtain at how those transmission investments come about. This is Plugging In. I'm Barry Wygel. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
Girish Behal is the Vice President of Projects and Business Development at the New York Power Authority. Girish, thanks for joining us today.
Barry, it's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit what NYPA and the New York Power Authority is and your role in New York.
So, Barry, New York Power Authority was formed under the Federal Act of 1931. First charge that came to New York Power Authority was when this organization, the Power Authority, was charged with building out the Niagara Dam, one of the largest hydropower projects in the U.S. Subsequently, New York Power Authority has built a number of other generating electricity assets in the state of New York. And today, we produce 25% of all electricity consumed in New York, 80% of which is carbon-free. So from that standpoint, we are a big player in the economic development of New York. In addition to that, we own roughly 1,550 circuit miles of high voltage transmission in New York, including the only 765 in New York. By that I mean it's 765 kVs, which is the extra high voltage that is used across the world. One of the things that I would like to share with our listeners today is we are not a taxpayer-funded entity. We are a self-funded authority, which means that we have to generate revenue through our generation assets and our transmission assets and pay the bondholders who hold the bonds that have funded these projects for New York. In addition to the critical role that we play on the electrical side, we also do a lot of work with various communities and our customers. We do a lot of work on economic development, environmental justice, and greenhouse emission reductions with a number of different communities across the state of New York. Most recently, we were charged with building renewables across the state of New York to support the CLCPA goals. As a part of that, NYPA is also asked to contribute roughly $25 million a year towards workforce development to enable a transition of the workforce for the green economy.
So when you talk about transmission and the assets that you have now, are these things that you built or are they things you just inherited or both?
It's a combination of them, right? There were certain projects, certain assets that we inherited after the World War II from the federal government. And subsequently, we ended up building additional assets within the state of New York to move power from where it was generated to where it is consumed. Now, I'm not sure, Barry, if your listeners are aware of this, but in New York, we like to divide from a technical standpoint the grid into two pieces, what we call the upstate grid and the downstate grid. And New York ISO has repeatedly talked about this as the tale of two grids, where the grid in the northern part of the state, which, I would probably define as anything north of Westchester, is primarily largely carbon-free. right? They've got a lot of resources. I mean, most of the hydro is there, most of the nuclear is there. So that basically behooves that they have a larger carbon-free grid, whereas the Westchester grid and the New York City and Long Island tends to be more towards the fossil fuel generation assets. So from that standpoint, transmission becomes an important part, and NYPA has been working with various public and private partners to build out transmission that supports the overall state goals.
So one of the things we talk about on this podcast is that status quo really isn't an option, especially when it comes to transmission. And that's not just because we want to move our generating sources from fossil fuels to clean energy, but just in general, stuff's getting old. So most people probably don't realize it. I come into work, I flip on my switch, the lights came on, I don't have to think about it. But I'm sure you are in the camp of we need to do more to plan for the future of a new grid, of a modern grid.
Barry, that's an interesting question because you're absolutely right. A lot of people, including me, when we come home and you flip the light switch on and we say everything's good. But when we start taking a look at what is happening in the near future, where we have a large load, what I would call economic development, I should say, coming into the state, and electricity is one of the largest, if not the largest, input to a lot of, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's service economy, or whether it is, an economy that is developing from a standpoint of entertainment or any other aspect. Right? It is an essential component of what people use in their day-to-day lives. The way to think about it is there was a lot of manufacturing in the US back in the 70s and the 80s into early 90s. So there was a lot of energy capacity or electricity capacity that was built out to support a lot of that. Over a couple of decades, a lot of that capacity went away. That left with extra energy capacity in the system. And then, we've seen the shift in the economy towards a service economy. We've seen some of the manufacturing coming back, and all that flowed in the system, or all that spare capacity in the system, has been consumed. And, with the electrification going on, we anticipate energy use to double over the next 20 years, right? So the question for us is not necessarily, are we good now? Or it's more of a question is, how do we make sure we are good 20 years from now? And how do we support economic development on an ongoing basis to continue to make sure that New York continues to grow?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So when we need a new high voltage line, who builds that? How does that come about? Because that's not just, National Grid needs a new line down my road to a new neighborhood. It's bigger than that.
It definitely is. Over the years, it has become a bit more complicated, but also in some ways, it has become a lot simpler. Typically, in the past, what we have done is followed what I would call the backward-looking planning mechanism, where, we continue to see load growth, and then when we start having issues in certain areas, we start looking for a transmission solution. And it has its own values. But now we're in an era where we are looking forward. We're looking at things in terms of what is going to happen in the next 10, 20 years, where we think there's infrastructure needs. Whether it's for the new manufacturing facilities or data centers, or for just the electrification or energy transition in New York City. And how do we plan for that? There are different phases that a transmission project goes through, and the first in itself, probably the most critical one, I would say, is the conceptual phase, where we identify what the needs are for the project and where it is needed. Once we have defined the problem, we look for solutions. So the different mechanisms that we have in New York in terms of looking at the problem definition is through the reliability processes at NYSO. For our listeners, New York Independent System Operator, in short, NYSO, is the operator for the grid in New York. So the New York ISO does run a transmission planning process. They do identify the reliability needs that are on the system to make sure that the system runs effectively. In addition to that, when we had the AREG CBA, which is, again, an acronym for Accelerated Community Benefits Act, and To be honest with you, I cannot remember the whole thing myself.
Right.
A process was put in place which is called CGPP, which is Coordinated Grid Planning Process. That process is governed by the New York Public Service Commission, where all the transmission owners in New York are part of that. There are a large number of stakeholders that are part of that process. And the intent of that process is to understand where New York needs to be from both an energy consumption and a generation standpoint over the next 10, 15 years, and where are the needs for the grid upgrades that are needed. So that is one process. So there are a lot of different planning processes that can come to a point where we have a good problem definition and we understand where the needs are. Once that happens, there are a couple of mechanisms that the Public Service Commission can deploy. One of the mechanism is the public policy transmission need. And I know I'm jumping ahead here, but it kind of all ties together, right?
No, it absolutely does. And let's just throw in another acronym. So the PPTN, right?
Yeah, it is the PPTN. And the public policy transmission need can either be a reliability need or it could be just a policy need where we are looking to build out transmission to resolve a concern. The Public Service Commission issues an order, in essence, directing the New York Independent System Operator to request solutions from the competitive market. At NYPA, we are one of the competitors in that process. We don't get any special treatment. We are treated like every other private entity out there. So we do go in and have been very successful in the recent past in terms of bringing very cost-effective transmission solutions to the New York ISO and the New York ratepayers. And I think it's important for people to understand that it is not always the cheapest solution. It is the most cost-effective solution. Right? It is the most beneficial solution from a system standpoint. It may cost a little bit more, but it solves more challenges. It creates more benefits. So it's a different value proposition that the New York ISO needs to look at from that standpoint. The other process there is also the reliability need process. You know, if there's a short-term need, the New York ISO can work with the transmission owner to potentially do some upgrades that are really needed in the short term to a large extent within the transmission owner's territory. The third process is the priority transmission project. This, in my view, is an additional tool in the toolkit that the Public Service Commission has, and is primarily focused for projects that are needed over the 3 to 5 year, maybe 5-year time frame that are needed to resolve system issues and are across multiple transmission owners' territories or maybe not. And the commission can request the New York Power Authority to do that project. An example of that right now is the project that we are working on with National Grid in the northern part of the state, known as Smart Path Connect. That is roughly a 110-mile transmission line upgrade that is intended to bring a lot more renewables into the southern part of the state.
And so is there a PPTN upcoming?
There is an actual PPTN right now in the process. It is called the New York City Public Policy Transmission Need. It is primarily needed to integrate offshore wind into the New York City grid. As our listeners may know, that New York has a goal of building out roughly 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And one of the biggest constraints that everyone has understood over the last few years is the ability of the offshore wind to interconnect into the grid. And there needs to be a coordinated grid to ensure that, we are connecting offshore wind into the system in a manner that does not harm the system. The Public Service Commission felt that it is important for us to coordinate those efforts, right? It is important for us to also demonstrate that we are in the process of building a grid that supports multiple generation resources. Currently, New York ISO is in the process of evaluating roughly 28 proposals, and it is a long drawn out process.
So we call these transmission investments. We need more investments in our transmission. And I think that's an important word to highlight is investment. So when I have my personal investments, you put some money in and then hopefully it grows and you get more benefits out. So is there benefits other than just keeping the lights on, which is obviously the most important thing, but are there benefits to these transmission projects?
I think there are multiple benefits to transmission projects. When we look at the long-term costs of what I would call a do-nothing scenario, if we do nothing, right, then you have several options. Either you build local generation resources, which could come at a significantly higher cost versus bringing in resources from other parts of the state. So there's that cost-ish concern where, raise costs to the consumers when you start building a lot of local generation when a transmission solution ends up being more cheaper and cost effective. In addition to that, I believe, at least that's my view, is electricity is the lifeblood of economy today. If you can transfer electricity from one place to other, make sure that your long-term costs are controlled and managed to a certain extent, it tends to have a positive growth impact on the economy. And not only the economy in the short term with the construction jobs and with respect to the local supply chain, but also long term where when you have the energy supply in an area, you tend to attract industries, whether it is manufacturing, which we have seen in the North Country, right? I mean, we have Micron, we have a number of other electricity consumers that are coming into the state, not because it's the most cost effective, but it's the best value for projects. So we see a lot of development happening from that standpoint. And some of these investments are 15, 20-year investments. And, the other aspect of that, which I think tends to be underappreciated, is the avoided cost. I mean, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change on a number of our communities. So a do-nothing approach really does not work from a long-term standpoint. These investments, and they are truly investments, benefit multiple generations because these are the assets that are built for 50, 60, 70 years from that time frame. In fact, right now, some of the projects we're working on tend to replace those assets that were built 50, 60, 70 years ago. And, to a certain extent, it also goes back to the comparison that I like to make between highways and the streets, side streets, right? The transmission tends to be the throughway. It tends to be the I-87. It tends to be the I-90, right? It tends to be, 6 lanes, full speed. You can go at 80 miles an hour, 75 miles an hour, your choice, and be able to get from point A to point B with certain exit points. And that turns into the local systems, which are the distribution systems, being the side roads, being the county roads from that standpoint, in being able to support the local households and the local markets.
So my last question, and I'll say I'm very glad and thankful that there's smart people thinking of all of this stuff so that, again, my lights will just continue to turn on. So thank you for the work that you do. But what is the general public's role in all of this? What should they be doing or supporting or keeping an eye on? What is their role in the work that you do?
I think the general public tends to be very involved when there's a project that directly impacts the local community. There are different mechanisms for them to raise concerns, but they tend to be, very focused in terms of what happens in the local community. We interact with local communities all the time. We try to communicate early and often. Some of the ways that they can be involved in is to just listen to you or listen to your show from that standpoint.
I agree. I'll second that.
And understand how some of these things that we talk about with respect to energy have an impact in our day-to-day life, right? Because it does. And we tend to take things for granted. And we only realize that maybe it's not cool when the lights go out. And, it is a challenge. It is a challenge because we depend on electricity more and more every day. So I think just educating themselves about how the grid works. And to your earlier point about smart people, I can definitely say that there are a lot smarter people than I am who operate the grid, who plan the grid, right? And it's not just being smart, it's also being strategic and also thinking about certain challenges and how do you resolve those in a very cost-effective way for the ratepayers of New York. Operators who operate the system, the transmission planners, all of them work day in, day out to ensure that we can have the electricity when we flip that switch on.
Absolutely. Well, Girish, I appreciate your time and thank you for joining us today.
And Barry, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in the future